The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Well, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse in the Middle East, with all the news in recent weeks about Egypt and Morsi being booted out and the Muslim Brotherhood's uprising, and now the scene, I guess you could say, has been shifted over to Syria, which in recent days has been grabbing a lot of the headlines. I thought that for the forum today I would take a little bit of time to give you some of the backstory on Syria, which is very interesting, to say the least. If you go back to the beginning of the Arab Spring that started in 2011, early on, if you remember, there was a CBS reporter that asked then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton why the United States was preparing to intervene against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, but not against Assad or Bashar Assad in Syria. And Mrs. Clinton said,
"There is a different leader in Syria now. Many of the members of Congress of both parties who have gone to Syria in recent months have said they believe he's a reformer."
He's a reformer, this man in Syria, Assad. And back then, and this is just 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, back then Clinton was just one of many of Assad's apologists in Washington, who was there talking about this man leading Syria into the new century, helping to modernize it and so on. Even before Mr. Obama became president, the New York Times back in 2005 had portrayed Assad and his wife as a pair of progressives who were struggling to modernize Syria, to bring it forward. And the New York Times at the time was really castigating, excoriating President Bush for not engaging with Syria. They were thinking that Mr. Bush and his administration was just kind of aloof and not giving enough attention to the leader in Syria. During the Senate confirmation hearing, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, said that Syria had one of the most advanced Arab state chemical weapons capabilities. That's what John Bolton said in 2005. And you know how that was received in Congress, at the CIA, in the news media? Well, he was lambasted for that because he was an alarmist. He was apparently saying things that were extreme about Syria's arsenal. He was ridiculed for that. In 2007, Nancy Pelosi, the famous congresswoman in Congress today, she maintained that the road to Damascus is a road to peace. Again, defending Assad, defending his regime, defending the administration, the dictatorship. In February 2010, this is according to Foreign Policy, the magazine, then Senator John Kerry told Qatari leaders that Israel should give up the Golan Heights to Syria, give it back. Syria has proven that it deserves to have that territory back. And according to this report, Kerry went on to say about Assad that he's a man who wants change. He did say that what Assad was doing with Hezbollah and interfering in Lebanese politics, that was unhelpful in his words. But he wanted change, and he is a reformer. Here again, there was this defense of Assad and his actions, even as late as March 16th, 2011. This was the day after the first mass demonstrations against Assad there early on in the Arab Spring. Senator Kerry said Assad was a man of his word and that he had been a very generous man, very generous with me, he said. So there was a close personal relationship between these two. Senator Kerry had dined with Assad on a few occasions and stood up for him. He said, "Syria will move, Syria will change as it embraces a legitimate relationship with the United States." Here he was, again, encouraging more dialogue, encouraging a friendlier relationship between Syria and the United States. Now, of course, you know John Kerry is today the Secretary of State for America, and today The Secretary of State says that the Assad regime is using chemical weapons on its own people. He came out with a strong statement just the other day, saying without hesitation that he had the chemical weapons. He was, in fact, using them. And evidently this speech was given in order to begin the drum beating for some kind of action against Syria. Let me just give you one quote from the remarks from Secretary Kerry. This was from August 26. He said, "What we saw in Syria last week should shock the conscience of the world. It defies any code of morality." He said, "The indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, the killing of women and children and innocent bystanders by chemical weapons is a moral obscenity. By any standard, it is inexcusable, and despite the excuses and equivocations that some have manufactured, it is undeniable." He goes on to say that there's nothing today more serious than what's happening in Syria. And that's saying a lot when you consider the state of our world today. Now, some have said that the administration is entitled to change its mind. The facts on the ground have changed, they say. The uprising has happened, and Assad's response has been really heavy-handed, and more than 100,000 people have died, and now resorting to chemical weapons, supposedly, it's crossing a red line. And to some extent, that's certainly true. I mean, sometimes a leader does have to abruptly change course. Sometimes a leader does have to reverse the path a bit to do the right thing. But if you look at the history, even going farther back than the last few years, this is much more than just a simple change in policy. The carnage in Syria really is exposing the utter incompetence of the administration that occupies the White House in Washington today. It's exposing the blatant hypocrisy in the current administration. And furthermore, it exposes the news media's shameless duplicity in covering foreign policy, because too much of the time the coverage depends, how it's covered depends on which administration occupies the White House. It shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is today. You can go back not more than 8-10 years and get an exactly opposite view for circumstances that are somewhat similar. Like Iraq, for instance. I mean, do you remember the stories about the chemical weapons that Saddam not only had, but actually used on numerous occasions on his own people? He did do that. It was interesting to just hear Secretary Kerry cite evidence, quote unquote, that's all over social media. And of course, you could run the same searches and find out what happened to some of those Kurdish towns back in the late 80s that Saddam Hussein was punishing for their support for Iran during that brutal war during the 1980s. Entire villages just wiped out. Back in 1991, this is 20-some years ago, 91 and 92, CBS, its popular news show, 60 Minutes, had exposed much of the truth about Saddam's arsenal, his chemical weapons, and his desire to get a nuclear weapon. This was something that he was pursuing, according to CBS. The reporter, Ed Bradley, compared Saddam to Adolf Hitler. He said, what we saw, and he visited Iraq, so he viewed the area, the territory, the villages that had been wiped out. He said, what we saw were detailed records, like the Nazis used to keep, extensive files of murders and destroyed villages, even videotapes of Iraqi soldiers carrying out these atrocities. He saw it. He saw the atrocities. He saw how the revenge was carried out. Saddam destroyed more than 4,000 villages, he reported. 4,000 of these Kurdish villages, and proudly recorded much of it. It said, drive down any road in this part of Iraq, and you see what used to be village after village, now reduced to rubble. These villages used to be home to at least 500,000 people. Tens of thousands of them, the Kurds say, almost 200,000, are still missing and presumed dead. That's from CBS back in the early 1990s. If you look at or search or Google the town of Halabja as many as 4,000 people were killed in an attack with a mixture of mustard gas, sarin, taboon, VX, all these poisonous substances put together that wiped out an entire city. Ed Bradley said the bodies of dead children littered the streets like discarded dolls. He concluded this investigation back in '92 by saying, earlier this week, a United Nations investigator released a report concluding that the scale of Iraqi human rights violations is almost without parallel since the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II. Without parallel, it reported. And so, as you progressed through the 90s, anytime that President Clinton had his run-ins with Saddam Hussein, the media obviously rushed to his defense. And you could say rightly so. I mean, you can see why they did. Because of the fact that Hussein was a brutal dictator who was killing off his own people, massacring his own people. He not only had the WMDs, as President Clinton once said, he used them, not once, but many times. He used them. He used those WMDs. Now, as you also probably remember, most of you are more familiar with President Bush's administration, but President Bush received no such support from the leftist media once he got tangled in Iraq in 2003. They abandoned him. They forgot about their own reporting, in fact, and went on with the fact that President Bush supposedly lied. There were no weapons of mass destruction. It was an unnecessary war. Well, Saddam, okay, he was brutal. He was mean. He killed some people. But America shouldn't have done anything there. You know the story. I mean, it just went on and on and on. And it continues to this day, really. The thing that struck me about Secretary Kerry's recent remarks regarding Syria is, if you read his speech, it's a fairly short speech, but if you read that speech and change the names to Iraq and Saddam Hussein, I mean, it could have easily been given 10 years ago. Easily. Mr. Kerry said this recently. He said, "We know that the Syrian regime maintains custody of these chemical weapons. We know that the Syrian regime has the capacity to do this with rockets. We know that the regime has been determined to clear the opposition from those very places where the attacks took place. And with our own eyes," Secretary Kerry said, "with our own eyes, we have, all of us, become witnesses." We've seen it. The world has to do something. The world must act. And the same thing could have easily been said about Iraq in 1991, in 1998, and in 2002. Easily. He said, "Our sense of basic humanity is offended not only by this cowardly crime, but also by the cynical attempt to cover it up. At every turn, the Syrian regime has failed to cooperate with the UN investigation, using it only to stall and to stymie the important effort to bring to light what happened in Damascus in the dead of night." Do you remember Saddam stalling, deceiving, putting up obstacles, sending inspectors all over the country on a wild goose chase? That's what happened. Just back up 10, 12 years. Same thing, same history. Different nation, different dictator, different tyrant. He said, Secretary Kerry, "Instead, for 5 days, the Syrian regime refused to allow the UN investigators access to the site of the attack that would allegedly exonerate them. Instead, it attacked the area further, shelling it and systematically destroying evidence." He said, "That is not the behavior of a government that has nothing to hide. That's not the action of a regime eager to prove to the world that it had not used chemical weapons." Any of this sound familiar? Destroying evidence, toying with the inspectors? It all sounds very, very familiar. I mean, there's some different circumstances this time around, for sure. And I'm not trying to justify action or, to say that there shouldn't be action. But when you point out the hypocrisy, it really does say a lot about the kind of coverage that we're getting today and why you need a true source that gives you the biblical perspective behind what's happening today in the world. because you have so much hypocrisy in politics, so much hypocrisy and duplicity in the media. You can't get the straight scoop. It's just impossible. Speaking of WMDs in Syria, why won't some in the major media ask where they came from? That's an interesting question that someone with some kind of intellectual curiosity you would think would put forward. How did they accumulate the biggest supply of chemical weapons in the Middle East? Where did that come from? Did they manufacture it themselves? Well, perhaps with some of it they did, but did you know about the large convoy of trucks that was scuttling across northern Iraq just before the U.S. invaded in 2003? That was caught. Satellite images caught that happening. There were a few, not enough, but a few, a UN inspector, an Israeli prime minister, other analysts that said there was plenty of evidence showing that Iraq had transferred much of its stockpile to Syria. And then a few years after that, the former general of Saddam Hussein, George Saida, came out with a book saying that it was absolutely certain that those WMDs were transferred. Absolutely. There were the Saddam tapes leaked in 2006, where he's there conferring with his top aides about how to obscure its weapons program, about how to hide the chemical weapons. Back in the early 1990s, John Kerry voted against booting Saddam out of Kuwait. Remember that history? Saddam invaded that little nation of Kuwait, and the first President Bush responded by taking action. Senator Kerry was against that act. In 2002, before the latest invasion of Iraq, the one that President Bush, the younger, started in 2003, Barack Obama made it clear, he wasn't president back then, he made it clear, though, that he was against that action. He was against the Iraq war. Well, remember 2008 in the campaign, he was against war, period. He was the anti-war candidate. He was the let's get our troops out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan. Just a little bit of history, not but a few years ago. But what has happened today? Well, even after he became president, if you remember, this was in September of 2009, I believe, another interesting angle to the latest development in Syria is what's going to happen with the United States if it goes around the United Nations, because President Obama came into office saying that, finally we're going to look to the United Nations. He waltzed right up to the stage there at the UN in 2009 and said, we've re-engaged, he said, the United Nations. We have sought a new era of engagement with the world. He talked about this beginning a new chapter in international cooperation, nations working together. And if you know anything about the Syria situation, Russia is dead set against any kind of intervention that would go against Assad. They're dead set against it. So how is the United States going to get around the Security Council at the UN with Russia there as a stumbling block, a roadblock? Well, it'll be interesting to watch. Just last week, the president told CNN, if the U.S. goes in and attacks another country without a UN mandate and without clear evidence that can be presented, then there are questions in terms of whether international law supports it. He said that last week. And now he's conferring with his lawyers about how to get around the UN. Wow. Let's look at Psalm 83. We don't have a whole lot of time here to conclude. I thought I'd just look at one prophecy. It does highlight, as I said, the confusion, the incompetence, the childishness, the deceit. But what is the big story here? I mean, what does it mean whether the U.S. goes in or doesn't go in? And if it does go in, and ends up going against Assad, or Assad's brutal brother. Some have said maybe he was the one responsible for triggering that chemical attack. Others have said it was maybe the rebels who want to get someone to intervene. There's still some murky details about who's behind it. Maybe it's a setup. Who knows? Who knows what's all going on behind the scenes? But what do we know based upon the sure word of Bible prophecy? What can we prove? Well, as we've covered before, this prophecy in Psalm 83, it reveals a dramatic shift in regional alliances there in the Middle East that's going to take place just before the return of Jesus Christ. And as it happens, Syria is right in the middle of it. Syria is going to take a dramatic shift here in the months and years ahead. According to Psalm 83, well, let me just read it starting in verse 5. It says, "For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against you, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites." That's referring to Saudi Arabia. It says of Moab. I won't list all the background here of who these peoples are. You can get some of our literature. The King of the South goes into this to study this further. But just with respect to the Syrian people, the Hagarenes there, anciently that was the people that lived in the region that is Syria today. It goes on to mention Gebal, which is Lebanon, and then Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. And then Ashur, it says there, which is Germany today, modern-day Assyria. It says Ashur also is joined with them. It says they have holpen the children of Lot, Selah. Now you have to put this prophecy together with Daniel 11 and see which nations, Iran and Egypt, among others, primarily, that get smashed by the strike from the king of the north. Right at the outset there of the Great Tribulation, or just preceding the great betrayal of Europe against the United States and Judah and the people of modern-day Israel today. But before that happens, there's that great clash, as you know about, between the king of the north and the king of the south. And it says that when that clash happens, the Middle East is going to be divided along the lines of the pro-Iranian camp and then those that resist against it, headed by Saudi Arabia. And what Psalm 83 says to us is that Syria is going to fall into the Saudi Arabian camp. And Saudi Arabia is behind the rebel forces in Syria. Those rebel forces are affiliated with terrorist organizations. There is no positive outcome here. Just from looking at it from purely a national perspective for the United States, there's no positive outcome. You can't support the dictator, you can't support the rebel forces without just throwing everything out of whack. But we can look to prophecy and see who's going to end up where and know that it leads right into the return of Christ. And that'll be fascinating to watch, particularly if the United States plays a role like it did in Egypt in pushing out the dictator and giving rise to these terrorist forces that are going to, in this case, unlike Egypt, ally with Saudi Arabia. And then you have these two camps clearly emerging throughout the region, setting the stage for that spectacular prophecy in Daniel 11. And all of that, as you continue reading through Daniel 11, all the way into Daniel 12, all of that, of course, sets the stage for the most spectacular event of all, and that's the return of Jesus Christ to this earth.